people sometimes ask me, because I post a few videos up now and then in terms of climate change and global warming and those sort of questions. People, know that me and Bart sort of hold a position that pretty much most of this is nonsense. There's no basis for it. It's just pretty much wild speculation with models. There's no foundation to it, strong scientific evidence. And on top of that, a lot of these people are manipulating data in many regards, no different than happens in the sort of the nutritional field. Adjustments and, unfortunately, when you take raw data, you don't get this sort of behaviour doesn't happen in hardcore science like physics. You don't take a measurement from a pulsar and then say, it doesn't really fit my model or my hypothesis. So I'm going to adjust the measurement so it actually fits perfectly. I mean, we know what that is. That's make-believe. That's made-up stuff. That's nonsense. It's falsification of data. It's manipulation of data. It's taking something that you've observed and altering it. It no longer has the same value. But unfortunately, in today's science and academia, there's so much corruption. There's so much profiteering at the top. I mean, you only have to take a look at the National Institute of Health. They get kickbacks. They even get part payments on the IP. I mean, I thought these people were public servants, working, getting paid a public servant salary. The IP should belong to the state. No different than the IP belongs to a company. So if you work for a company, you get paid by the company, but the IP, the intellectual properties that is, belongs to the company that you work for. I don't understand why scientists at the National Institute of Health actually get the IP. Well, they got paid by the government and given fancy labs with a lot of good equipment, which they wouldn't have in their own sort of place, to be able to do this work. And they're getting on top. Now you can understand why this can corrupt the research, because there's kickbacks. And it's the same thing with the sort of climate nonsense. You've got these sort of banking elites and corporate tech elites and stuff like that have gone through this woke academia, that have gone through this left-wing academia, have been indoctrinated in neo-Marxist, Fabian socialist ideas and all that. They've intermixed that with their own sort of view of the world and created this political concoction, which they virtual signal everyone else and believe that they are the natural rulers because they're better than everyone else. So they've justified it like this in their minds. And obviously they are pushing these agendas because when they saw after the 2008, this Occupy Wall Street, they saw that the people, there was a sort of a movement that it was grassroots. It wasn't sort of controlled by the left or the right. It was just a sort of a mass movement that just emerged, and there were people from the left and right that were just disgruntled about the whole situation. They realised that they need to play the race card, they need to play the climate stuff, they need to play all these other games, the gender stuff, everything under the sun, in order to divide and rule the population. Because if this gets traction against the bankers, they won't be able to do their nefarious little tricks in the background. See, for them, there were two options. They either basically had a potential future government where politicians on both sides of the aisle went after the bankers, And that means the whole Ponzi scheme could potentially fall apart or be put at risk. And so for them, they saw, well, what happened in 1929? A lot of us bankers went bust and we were jumping out of skyscrapers because none of us wanted to be poor. And it was, that would have been a major reset to the system. But that's what they were fearful of. And so they realised they needed to create new movements to divide and rule the society and have people fighting and squabbling over all these other issues in order. That's why they finance these things, But they do have long-term, depopulate sort of agendas. Malthusian. I mean, people like Bill Gates and many others of those, George Soros and people like that, have quite clearly expressed these ideas. So it's not as if anyone's making it up or saying it. They've put it on the record, okay? They've actually put it on the record. And so their view, and Larry Finn from BlackRock, he's put it on the record as well. And he's also said that, you can't trust the masses, the masses, us. We need to tell them what to do and how to live and how to behave and all that. So it's all about control. They want to control the future to survive and create their dystopia. That's the whole purpose. All the rest is just nonsense. Dumb down the education system, dumb down the population, divide and rule, turn people against each other in order to basically control the developments in society. For them, it's an existential threat. If their Ponzi scheme goes pear-shaped and they can't rely on a government that's not friendly to them, bought and paid, so to speak, then potentially the risk is very big that they could basically get the shaft, so to speak. And they're sitting on a mountain of derivatives and many other things, something like 53 trillion, bigger than the American economy. And some people think it could be as big as 100 trillion of paper crap. Speculation, basically, for the bankers, their investment friends, and everyone else. Well, the way to basically deal with this sort of problem is inflate away all these debts. Because remember, the more, an example, let's say you've got a house, costs $1 million now. Let's say you debase the currency even further. You owe $1 million on it. You bought it at top of the, and pretty much nearly 100% you borrowed, as an example. Now, let's say you debase the currency by 90% by printing shitloads of money. What's your debt to equity going to be? Well, that's going to inflate all the way up to probably 10 million. Now you only owe 10%. You've impoverished the rest of society who are squabbling about genders and whatever else, but you've just basically lowered your debt levels substantially. Now you owe, because it doesn't really matter. You own the assets. The more the assets appreciate, your debt servicing requirements go down substantially. And then you could always do a debt jubilee or reset at a future date and just, with digital currency, just pay off all your mates and, settle everything and reset the whole thing to where you own everything and the rest of you fools own nothing. As Klaus from the WEF, World Economic Forum, has told us on countless occasions, it's not as if he's holding it secret. He's telling us, and most of these characters are, we'll give you a little, some wages, well, not even wages, sort of a social wage or a sort of, what's it called? I forget now. Just some additional welfare, basically. But the reality is the more they print, that welfare just can't keep up with inflation. Now, obviously, if they were a bit wiser, they'd actually be pumping out more oil in, like in the past when they were debasing the currency, but they were pumping out more cheap energy, they were able to mask the inflation. And while that inflation went into equities, properties, bonds, shares, all this sort of other stuff that it sort of ballooned, but it didn't go into the general economy. So you didn't get a lot of inflation because of cheaper energy. So that's how they were. But now that they've gone woke and crazy for other political reasons, they adopted these movements not because they really believe in them, but they've adopted them because they're useful to divide and rule, in particular their opponents. And that's the whole purpose of why they've created all these movements. It's not to basically, because they believe in them, they only believe in themselves, their money, and their power. That's all they believe in. All the other stuff is just nonsense, which they peddle out to the rest of us in order to, pursue their divide and rule agenda so they can stay at the top. That's the whole purpose of the whole thing. But getting back to the subject matter, when it comes to looking at any system, you've got to say, well, how can I analyse an atmosphere? You've got to, that's a legitimate question to ask. How do I analyse the atmosphere? Simple. There's a class of mathematics called fluid dynamics. But I can tell you, if you were to simulate the entire atmosphere in order to determine for only 10 years into the future, what the weather would be like exactly accurately, perfectly accurately, it would take longer than the universe has been around in years with the current sort of global computer power that we've got. Pretty much impossible. Then you've got the other question, data collection. We've got a problem with data collection. You've got the rim of fire around the Pacific. You've got heaps and heaps of carbon dioxide that's coming out from there. Then you've got the general gassing that the oceans do. Remember, most of the world is ocean, 75% of it, more or less. Land is far less. So, it's more reliable. Ocean temperature is far more reliable than land temperature in that sense. But it's not used because it doesn't fit the narrative, as I said. It just doesn't fit. And if you look at, maritime, temperature gauges, which is the maritime industry and all that, you don't see this global warming. You don't see this. You see the normal variability over time. You don't see this sort of stark sort of thing. The reality is you don't even see it in the terrestrial data. What they're using is they are deliberately manipulating the data and they're deliberately taking the urban heat island effect. So stations that are around urban areas, airports and stuff like that, where before they were in rural areas, it's just the urban areas grew out into those areas. And now that temperature gauge is no longer in a rural area. And now obviously it's showing over years and years a progression of upward progression. But that's just a localized temperature. That's a localized climate, nothing to do with the globe. You can't extrapolate from that. But they throw all that in because it fits the narrative, remember. So that's how it works. But it is impossible to get sufficient data collection. The majority of our data is from North America and Europe, a bit from Australasia, that's it. Most of the other world doesn't have very good records, and most of them, in some of the more affluent countries now, still the majority of them are in the Northern Hemisphere, not in the Southern Hemisphere. So we've got, even there, the terrestrial data is completely incomplete in terms of and let alone it's highly confounded. And when you look at rural areas, their gauges over time, you don't see these marked increases. It's just up, down, just the sort of variability that you would expect. The seasonal and the 11 years, which has to do with the sun's cycles and stuff like that. So it's just nonsense. It's pretty much nonsense in that regard. So when you take out the terrestrial, this is what the Conleys, that Bart talks about up in that live in Ireland, the son and father, who basically look at the terrestrial data, stripped away all the urban stuff and just looked at the rural stuff, showed quite clearly just nonsense, pretty much just the normal variability, and that matched better the same sort of level that you find with the high altitude sort of balloon data. Again, matching. The crackpots made up a whole lot of bullshit propaganda that in the atmosphere it's sort of different, apparently, molecules in certain parts of the atmosphere will move differently and accumulate differently. Magical stuff. Only a crackpot could come up with such notions. You would think in an atmosphere to get sort of even distribution with lower densities or whatever of certain things in the different elevations, but pretty much, you wouldn't get a lot of variability, obviously, That's what they don't like. They look at that sort of stuff and they go, it's just normal variability. It's not good for us. So they ignore it or adjust it, as they call it, because to match the terrestrial stuff, there's some sort of feedback that we don't really know why it happens. And they come up with all sorts of notions, which are just illogical. Then there's the other notion that, the Earth is also, the surface of the Earth is also basically, it's got all these minerals, and they, under pressure, they actually create more heat, and that heat sort of comes through the surface and sort of intermixes with the carbon that's in the lower the lower parts of the atmosphere, and it sort of amplifies and that's another feedback. But when they actually went and did some research recently, some scientists, they actually found that a lot of the minerals under pressure actually get colder, like boron actually gets colder. Potentially a good use, potentially if they can make sort of chips out of boron, or they can incorporate it in chip manufacturing, they may be able to deal with a lot of the heat problems that you get with silicon wafers. So any IT person out there, boron could be the future of IT, to lower the temperature within and be able to miniaturize even further potentially. Anyway, let's move on. I'm not going to do any more plugs about boron. I've done them before. But when we look at the basis for that, it's a bust. There is no real increases from below. And when people have tried to measure them, they can't freaking find them. They can't really find something substantial. So that's sort of, they've gone a bit quiet about that, obviously, because, there's too much stuff that's come out recently that sort of kicked that in the arse. And so that sort of feedback sort of stuff isn't as credible anymore. So they've sort of walked away from it. They still talk about these feedback loops, but they don't discuss them exactly what they are. It's just sort of in a general way for confusion without actually discussing the subject matter. Recently also, there was some research done by two academics, one from Israel and one from Denmark. Now, the guy from Denmark, has done, stuff in the past regarding climate change and stuff like that. And, I wouldn't call him, wouldn't call him basically somebody that's in the past enlightened, was slightly on that bandwagon, slightly. The Danes, all the Norwegians, all that, they're sort of all like with blinkered. I'm not trying to be insulting, but it's follow the American sort of line. It's they're sort of very blinkered in that approach. Where luckily these two got together and started looking at a whole lot of other data. And guess what they found? They actually found that, people probably know about sunspots. When magnetic fields really increase within the sun, you get these little spots, as they called, sunspots, these darker areas. That's the magnetic field twisting a lot of, and it comes to the surface, those strong magnetic fields come closer to the surface and you can see them. Now, the energy coming out of the sun, there isn't a lot of, the differences between when you have sunspots and when you don't have sunspots, the increase isn't that substantial. But the temperature, when there are more sunspots, tends to go up. Now, that's what's been happening for the last, since they started talking about 2 decades ago and getting all wound up and excited about this global warming. Now it's sort of flattened out. They're going, we don't know what's happened, They're trying to use all sorts of excuse. Oh, it's this, it's that. People are using less. No, they're not. You go to Asia, they're pumping out CO2 like there's no tomorrow. What are you talking about? So that argument started to, weigh thin, and people are starting to go, hold on, what's happening? And they're trying to use all these other excuses. We need to adjust things a bit more, and it goes on and on. There's always an excuse. We didn't do this right or that, or we didn't take this into consideration or that. They just don't have any credible arguments. They're scratching their heads wondering, what are we missing? And they're using this sort of same language in some of their literature, but they won't admit that there's a problem with their hypothesis and definitely a problem with the models, because the models just cannot compute the level of stuff that's required, let alone the data putting in, crap data in, crap information out. You're not going to get a very good result out of a model which is insufficient information, let alone insufficient processing capability that we've got. So it's very much, the levers within the model are very much speculative. They won't tell you that, but that's really what it is. Because each year, as new information comes out, there's weather balloons and there's aircraft that fly. They look at the temperature gauges. They have to adjust their models continuously. But it's, again, within that sort of mindset. It's not science. It's just basically make-believe. It's models. Models are not real science. It's simulating something that you think you understand, but that's not reality. That's just basically made up stuff. Now, when we look at what these two scientists did, they looked at all the data of solar radiation. They noticed that there is a slight reduction in the solar winds when there's no sunspots. I think that's slightly less the intensity. And then they, for some reason, which surprised me, they looked at cosmic rays. So they pulled out all the data that NASA had on cosmic rays, and they combined the two. It matched. They were shocked. And what it showed is, when you have cosmic rays out there, cosmic rays, if the intensity is slightly less, and this is why the crackpots say, well, it can't be the sun because the sun doesn't have much variability. And they're correct about that. They are absolutely right about that. But it's not carbon dioxide. They missed the big one, cosmic rays. And if somebody was using their brain, they would have worked it out. When you've got more ice cover, as you've got the Milankovitch cycles, and you've got all these other cycles of 100,000, 40,000 years, and 20,000. All these cycles, means that the sort of the rotation of the actual on the axis of the Earth varies slightly, and also its rotation around its orbit, so to speak, around the sun varies slightly over many years, many thousands of years. And what happens is, if in the summer, for instance, less ice melts because of the way it's rotating around the sun, its orbital position and axis, small amounts, less ice melts, then the next year less again. So you've got a bit of more accumulation. And what does ice do? Reflects energy back into space. Got it? And so you cool, and one exacerbates the other. And it sort of gets more ice, begets more ice, begets more ice, begets more reflectivity, gets more ice, lower temperature, and blah, 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 because you can hold less, you're reflecting it out. So these are big things that actually shift. What are the others that the climate experts, more experts to poke, that you can poke a stick at, what are they ignoring? What are the big greenhouse gases? Water vapor. And the other component to that is clouds. What do clouds do? They reflect solar radiation. What happens when you've got more cosmic rays coming through? They actually increase the amount of cloud produced by our atmosphere. There's the missing link. That variability may be minor from the sun, but it's the cloud formation that is different, that is amplifying those differences in temperature, those differences in, the global sort of temperature. And it sort of explains why carbon dioxide has nothing to do with it, because carbon dioxide, if more temperature comes in, yes, as a greenhouse gas, methane, carbon dioxide, water vapor, which is the big one anyway, the other ones are minor, will hold on to more of that energy, and our atmosphere will be slightly warmer, and we as people will feel slightly warmer on planet Earth. But it has nothing to do with those. It's the amount of energy being held or reflected. That's really what it is. So, things that scientists back in the 60s and 50s and all that believed, and should go back to believing before the crackpots took over, because that's really what is happening. By looking at the data that comes from this source, they were able to see, oh, shit, it's the cloud formation that's determining it. And that explains why when you look at rural weather stations in the United States and elsewhere, and Australia and all that, temperatures were much higher in the late 30s and early 40s, and then came down in the 70s. And remember, in the 70s, the big commotion, you can go back and look at videos from the 70s. The Ice Age is coming. That's what they called out. The Ice Age is coming and all that. But that was at the lowest element. And then it reversed. Then it went from an Ice Age coming, which was just normal variability, from an Ice Age coming to basically, it's going to cook the planet. It's global warming. And man is responsible. Hold on. Why wasn't it happening between the 30s and the 70s as we were rapidly industrializing? Remember, you had the Green Revolution in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. You had massive industrialization around the world, and we were pumping out shitloads. Electrification had more or less taken place in large parts of the world, at least 50%, if not more, of the world. So why was the temperature going down since then? They had to adjust it. But if you go and actually look at the old records, you'll actually see it's coming down. If you go and look at the old Scientific America articles showing from that era coming down, just because the crackpots that now control academia, control these organisations, are making all these adjustments and say, oh, we need to make the adjustments because they didn't measure it accurately. Bullshit. Those you don't need to measure a weather station. It tells you exactly what it's detected and it's recorded. Why are you changing that data? That's fabricating the truth. Like I said earlier, cosmic rays doesn't fit the model. I'm going to adjust it. That's not science. That is not even pseudoscience. That's basically fraud, scientific fraud, deception, lies. That's what it is. It's not real science. So really what is driving this variability that we're seeing is these changes in the reflectivity of cloud cover. So it's really clouds that are driving it. Not even the Conleys know the reason. They know that they've looked at the terrestrial and they've looked at atmospheric, and they know these people are talking bullshit, but they don't know exactly all the drivers. Now, this team of Danish and a person that came from the climate nonsense, the Danish guy, with the Israeli guy, have actually done some really top-level science, grabbed real raw data, compared it, and seen the relationships that it perfectly relates and explains why. And it's, as I said, like the ice reflecting, well, the same thing with clouds. You build up clouds, they'll reflect more solar radiation, which means your planet cools. When there is less cosmic rays that can penetrate through because the sun is just slightly a bit stronger, enough to cancel or weaken the amount of cosmic rays that get through, you'll get less cloud cover that will be formed. And people can go and look at that. They can actually go and look at that data because NASA provides it. You can actually go through and look at weather maps, from, satellite data and all that. You can actually see and then just match it. Anyone can do it. These just scientists did it in a very rigorous, measured way as scientists, but even the average person can go and look at their data and see the differences in cloud formation in those years and the temperature relation, and go, oh, that makes more sense. So it's not impossible for a citizen scientist to actually do that as well. There's a lot of information out there that now we can, just one Google step away, so to speak. So really that's explains far better than some fantasy feedback loops that they can't understand. That data, which is basically based on cosmic rays, explains far better why, and why some of these scientists also got duped by other scientists. They got duped because, when the skeptics were saying, well, the sun's really the driver, well, they were saying, well, the intensity, that variability is very minor, doesn't really explain all the thing. And the arguments were, you're wrong, we're right. The other people were saying, well, we know that when you experiment with carbon, you don't see much. It doesn't hold. Water vapor has a bigger role. But they just didn't have that other piece. Both groups are missing the other piece, both the crackpots and the skeptics. To be skeptical is to be scientific, because you should always be skeptical, even of your own data. That means that's the right mindset. You have to always try and disprove your hypothesis in order to make it stronger. It's like we still are skeptical about the theory of relativity. We've put it through countless times through experimentations to see, does time dilation work? Does this, that? And we've even noticed variations or stuff like that, which is, so we're not to say that the theory's got cracks in it. In general, it works, but there may be under some circumstances where it doesn't, no different than, you can still launch a rocket with Newton's laws of gravity. But we know that since Einstein, that the picture is a bit more complicated. So all these things, you can understand why certain people fell into that, and especially younger people when they're impressionable, they've got these mentors who are telling them this is it. It's hard to argue, and then they look at solar activity and they go, there isn't much variability. There must be, it's either carbon or maybe carbon and some feedback loops. We're trying to find what other factors are actually at play. Well, they missed the big one, cosmic rays. That was the big one. That one explains why, and it sort of explains quite clearly, as we know through all the, going into glacial and interglacial periods, that it always is this sort of the orbital position that allows either more ice to be formed and less to melt in a certain period in summer, and then that adds to the reflectivity to reflect back solar radiation and remove that energy from the planet, so the sort of the greenhouse gases can't capture it, so to speak. So it's not the gases, that's really to do with the amount coming in. So when we look, we've looked at periods of time when there were something like close to 7,000 parts per million back in the Cambrian explosion, which is when complex life emerged all over. We're carbon life forms. Carbon is the foundation of organic chemistry, the foundation of life. So people need to stop talking nonsense, because if you're against carbon, you're against life. Then when we look how important, because we're in a carbon famine at the moment, more or less, we're too very low compared to historical levels, which were much higher. And life does much better. We know that plants do much better. And we've actually noticed there's, if you Google NASA, the greening of the planet, there's even research, even though I disagree with some of the comments that the academics made in that study, but that's because they're brainwashed. But even they noticed that what has happened is the extra carbon dioxide that's actually been put into the atmosphere is greening the planet, because voila. And not only that, it's also reducing the water problems for a lot of plants, because the stoma, which is little mouths as they're called on the leaves, the stoma, they will not open. If there's low carbon, they'll all open and they lose more fluids. So water needs are higher. If there's more carbon in the atmosphere, less of the stoma open, because they can absorb efficiently more, they can grow and have less water loss, which means their water requirements go down. So they can actually then move into arid and desert regions and actually spread. Vegetation can spread. And what we've seen throughout the world is the greening of the planet. And satellite data does not lie. Remember, I'm in mapping. We look at vegetation and we can see vegetation around the planet has increased, including in Tasmania. Okay, the crackpots will basically come up with all sorts of nonsense, but that is the reality. We know that carbon is the stuff of life. Any person who's in agriculture knows that if you get into a hothouse and you pump 1,000 parts per million, things grow and you get a bumper crop. That's why they buy carbon, a lot of these, hothouse farmers, because they know they can really make a lot of money. They can feed the plants. And that's really what's happening that people need to understand, is that carbon is food for life. It's life. Anybody that's opposed to carbon is anti-life. Now, if we look at historic and go back, because, a lot of people talk about, you've probably heard, what is net zero? Because that's another nonsensical thing that a lot of people talk about net zero. And most people are, completely ignorant what it is. What net zero is, the sort of argument, we need to get back to 55% of 2010 levels. So 2010, the levels were around about 389, nearly, slightly less. I can't exactly remember the exact figure. And so I'm just rounding things off. And so at 55% of CO2 levels of 2010, that's about 214. Okay, so 214, just put that into your head. Now, if we go back all the way back to the 1750, we're talking about very early in the industrialization, in the emergence of industry and the Industrial Revolution and all that, way back when, the times when let's say, take Scotland, for instance, the population, like a tenth of the population was in towns and cities, and 90% were in the rural areas in, slightly 50, 60 years earlier. That's when they had the sort of, can't remember exactly, approximately, sort of towards the probably 70 years or 80, when they had the potato famine, which was in Ireland and Scotland. That's why there was a lot of people that immigrated from there to the Americas and elsewhere, but also to cities. So less than 100 years later, because of these low levels of carbon dioxide, poorer agriculture production, it was a regular thing back then. Starvation, famines were a regular thing in the past. Globally, there were massive starvations and famine episodes in that time. Now, by 1750, a third of the Scottish population now was in towns and cities. 2/3. So they went from 90% down to 2/3. That's what a shift, a massive shift. And now it's like we're reversed completely in most industrialized countries, like 90-10, more or less, in most countries. It's the complete reverse. And at the time, in 1750, the ppm, parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, were 278. So 278 divided by 214, which is about 30% higher than net zero. Do you understand what I'm saying? Do these people, as I said, is this rebellion extinction or extinction rebellion, is the main target humans? Looks like it. Whether it's, understood like that by these people or not, these are very, very dangerous people in the way they're thinking. Very, very dangerous. So they have the potential, if we were to move by the middle of the century to that level, let's say we were able to drop CO2 to those sort of levels, you can expect mass starvation throughout the whole planet. We're talking about a period when there was less than 1 billion people on the planet, and they were undergoing starvation. Now, obviously, we've got the Green Revolution, we've got petrochemical inputs, but even they are, that's right, they're too carbon intensive, they're going to be removed. So if you because there's the attack on the farmers now, if you remove nitrogen, you remove all the fertilizers and all that sort of stuff, you're creating a condition where you're not going to basically reduce the population. You could potentially starve the overwhelming majority of the planet and end up with a population like 300 million on the whole planet. We're talking about crazy stuff. And remember, if you get down to 180 parts per million plants really struggle, really struggle. And if you drop below 150, all plants die, which means if plants die, so do animals. Got it? So getting down to a level of 214 is way too low. It's dangerous in terms of crop yield would collapse. And with crop yield collapsing, well, and even we're talking about even grasslands. Grasslands would retreat. You'd get more desertification, more arid areas that would emerge on the planet, and less grasslands. So even animals that are on grasslands would decline in numbers. So even if you wanted to eat animals, there'd be less around. So we're talking about a potential catastrophe based on a non-problem because they've never proven it, and their science is just pseudo crap. And I mean, if people want to look at some of this data and stuff like that, I'm going to put links. There's Tony Hiller and many others that basically provide a lot of this information. So I'm not going to replicate their information because that's illogical. But they actually go through all this information and provide, and we're talking about, these are all academics. We're not talking about crackpots that are referred to. These are all academics that disagree with the narrative. These are the skeptics that basically say this is nonsense. And their argument is, hold on, you're arguing this, but here's the data, the real data, the historical data, that's raw data, not fabricated, not adjusted, but the raw data doesn't match what you're saying. It doesn't match it. It doesn't even come anywhere near. And so that's what people need to go and do. If you are skeptical or you're questioning or you're not certain about some of this sort of stuff, go and check this stuff. You've got to take the plunge and try and inform you. Don't blindly just accept things because that's what most people do in nutrition, in everything. And that's why we're so unhealthy, because we just accept things at face value. Very wrong. You should always question things. Obviously, you can't discard things without knowledge, because that as well is illogical. But if you go and look at some of these sites, you see the information that's actually been presented, go and look at the sources. Go back, grab the sources, look, what are they saying? I've given you a concept of an interaction between cosmic rays and solar radiation, cloud formation and stuff like that, that provides a far more logical picture. And it actually shows, as we had this change in sunspots and solar activity slightly, we had more cloud cover, more reflectivity, a cooling from the late 1930s into the 1970s, when everyone was saying we're heading for another ice age. And remember, since the Second World War in the 40s to the 70s, we were pumping out shitloads of CO2. Coal-fired power stations, gas stations. The automotive industry exploded in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And that's why we had the big crisis with the oil crisis that caused the big economic issues, because there were so many damn vehicles around. But the temperature was still going down. And we were apparently heading for an ice age. All the scientific magazines in those days, Scientific American and all that, I still read them. We're heading for another ice age. Even Scientific America, when there was some arguments by some crackpots who will say, oh, look, we've got this urban heat island effect. Could that play a role and all that? There is some data out there that some people were saying, and then other people would chastise these people and say, no, that's just the urban heat island effect. Has nothing to do. The global temperature is coming down. We've got the satellite information. We've got the weather balloons in the Arctic and the Antarctic with all the weather stations. We've got all these sort of things coming in and showing that there is a marked decrease continuing year in, year out. You know, NOAA, NASA, all these organisations were feeding data back, showing that raw data. Back then, at least, it wasn't captured by these ideologues. You know, academia hadn't been completely bastardised to the level that it is today, hadn't been captured by these ideologues of the left that have just got an ideological agenda. And they are, you know, helpful, useful idiots for the globalists, the financiers, and the tech billionaires to use them to basically don't look at Wall Street, just keep on mucking around with your own mental sort of crazy ideas. You know, so they fed them slightly things and then just let them go on their own. And it worked. That's why they're still in power and nobody's protesting against them, even though they've completely and utterly upended the system. People are willing to basically go lock themselves in 15-minute cities and sacrifice their living standards to save mummy Earth, which doesn't need saving. It needs saving from the Bill Gates and the Larry Finns and the George Soros of the world. It doesn't need saving from anything else. And so obviously people have been duped, and the mass media that's controlled by these people, remember now the big State Street, Vanguard, Larry Finn's BlackRock, they control most of the stock companies, the majority shareholders in most of the companies of the S&P 500. They control the media, they control everything, which means they're pushing all these agendas of divide and rule and the inflation agenda as well. So to save their asses, pretty much, from a 1929 type incident. Remember that. So people that keep on calling on the government to print more money and all that are basically guaranteeing that everything, property, everything's going to become so expensive, you're going to be a serf. You're going to own nothing. You won't be able to afford anything in that sort of inflationary world. You'll just be able to virtual signal to your mates and get food stamps and, you know, eat kibble and whatever. That'll be your future. And that's the reality. And that really works well for Bill Gates and Larry Finn and all these sort of people, because that means we've got all these people down here that are potential threat to our interests being diverted in with all sorts of nonsense. And it's working for them. But when you look at the whole nonsense, it's nothing there. It's just smoke and mirrors. It is impossible. Let me say that again. It is impossible to model the atmosphere. It's too complex. You know, and this is physicists saying this, that it would take longer than the time that the like I think one said that it's potentially the length of time that the universe existed squared with all the computing power on Earth to just simulate 10 years. Plus, you would have to have a lot of accurate data points from everywhere, like evenly spaced weather stations at the terrestrial level, on land, at sea, in the atmosphere, continuously feeding all this information, accurate information of all these measurements, measuring both carbon dioxide and temperature at the same time and feeding it into a complex system, measuring clouds, measuring the other concentrations of the other gases, everything, and feeding that in. It would mean trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars, actually more than the whole global economy is, in order to just get the data. You can see that it's impossible. You know, and they will argue, oh, it's impossible to prove it They may argue at some point, and it's impossible not to disprove it. It's best to be prudent. You'll hear that at some point in future time once the narrative starts breaking down. It's best to be prudent. Bullshit. So prudent for whom? And so it's really important to people to understand this. I mean, I've looked into this. I believe that nonsense as well, I'll be honest. If I go back less than a decade, I still believed that nonsense. I had also, because I never looked into it. I just believed these are scientists, they're doing the right thing, they're doing their research and doing stuff like that. They're not going to be doing anything nefarious. Since I had my cardiovascular incident, my mild heart attack, and I had bypass surgery and all that, I started questioning things. Like many other people, when you're that close to death, you start going, hold on, what's wrong with this? They told me to do this, this, and this. I did it, and I end up like this. I was supposed to live longer than that other guy. What's happening? And so I went down a whole lot of rabbit holes to realise that I'd been duped. And then the more rabbit holes I've been down in others, I realised I've been duped about a lot of things. Now, not all science is bad. Some hardcore science like physics, chemistry, and stuff like that is bona fide. They still need to do good science in material science, physics, chemistry, stuff like that, because they still need to be able to build computers, build all these things. Because remember, computers are, tunneling electrons. They're using quantum physics. You need to be able to know how to design things to behave in that sort of way. So it's not as if the physics, we may not have complete physics. We've still got a lot of questions in between, but the stuff we know, we've experimented, we know works okay. We may not have the right explanation, but we definitely know that there is a strong nuclear force, a weak nuclear force, there's gravity, there's all these things, electromagnetism, all these things, and we've measured them, we've experimented multiple times. So this is sort of hardcore established stuff. But when it comes to the climate area, God almighty, that is an area that is just divorced of any real solid science. The only thing you can actually, the good stuff there is the ice core data, for instance. The ice core data is good. It's the stuff that, remember, Al Gore showed the hockey stick nonsense where they had adjusted the earlier data, the crackpots, had adjusted the earlier data for him to make it look flat rather than this coming down and then going back up. So that was just sort of make-believe. But the other stuff that was important that Al Gore didn't tell you is that the carbon sort of levels. So when you look at, they sort of follow with the temperature sort of together. What he didn't tell you, what scientists that do ice core data will tell you, is temperature precedes carbon by 600, hear this again, 600 to 800 years. That's a long time. So you need a rising temperature for 600 to 800 years before you start seeing a rise in when you're getting more significant gassing from the oceans, where the majority, it's a carbon sink, the oceans. It's not only the vegetation or the forests. The biggest is the oceans. When the oceans are cool, they basically absorb, even at night, more when the oceans are cold, they absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and they gas it out in the daytime. It's exactly the same thing that happens when you've got a soda. You put a soda in the fridge and open up a soda in the fridge when it's cold, inside a fridge. You don't get any fizz because the carbon in there, the temperature's too low. It's contained. You get very little fizz. But if you take it out of the and you put it on the bench and it gets to room temperature and then crack it open, what happens? Psst, fizzes quite a bit. And because of when it's warmer, you actually get more gassing. It's well known. It's not something, it's known. It's basic science, basic physics. Anybody that with half a brain cell knows that. And that's really, how it actually works. Now, to get into deeper parts of the ocean, it can take up to 600 to 800 years to get all the way down to the deeper parts of the ocean. So it can take a lot of time for some of that to come back out and gas out. It's usually the surface stuff in the daytime. That's why you get small variability, and there's not much variability at all. That's why you don't get much, when you measure, there's not much change from day to day or whatever, because the small amount of gassing and the small amount of absorption at the surface, that's just the cycle, the 24-hour cycle that's actually taking place. But the biggest sink is the oceans in that regard. Now, there are other things that could be increasing the gassing. That's tectonic plate movements, which we don't understand fully. The rim of fire around the Pacific, where there's all these volcanoes, there's more volcanoes in the oceans, at the bottom of the oceans, than there are on land. Remember that. And they actually spew out CO2. So they change the composition of the actual, but it's not a problem. It doesn't affect negatively. That's another nonsense. Affect negatively life. Because remember, back the Cambrian explosion was nearly 7,000 ppm, and life blossomed. Remember, when you take calcium and CO2 and combine them, you're able to make shells. That's how all crustaceans and all that do. And there's people that have done experiments, but it takes, even if you're trying to infuse, let's say you've got in 2 tanks, there's an experiment one of the skeptics did, put 2 crustaceans, pumped in CO2 into one, and the other one just oxygen. It was, and looked at both of them. Guess what? The one with the CO2 grew bigger, and the other one grew slower, showing quite clearly more CO2, you produce a bigger crustacean, it was, I think it was some sort of like a, what do they call them? I forget. Anyway, but the story of that is that when that's sort of true experimentation. Do you know how all that myth happened about carbon dioxide being an acidifier that's going to damage life in the oceans? Well, that was just nonsense. They actually used an acid, which they put in the water. And obviously, that's not carbon dioxide. It was a proxy. Yeah, we know they're made up proxies. They're bullshit. That's bullshit. You need to, because they wanted, they suppose said, well, we can't wait for months and months. Well, the other guy did it for 6 months to show quite clearly, because it takes a long time to absorb CO2 deeper into the water. But the crustacean, when that increased CO2 happened, was able to combine the CO2 with the calcium in the water and build a bigger shell and grow bigger as well. And when we look back at archaeological evidence of the Cambrian era and all that, we see these massive animals, the fossilized, these massive creatures compared to today, because there was more CO2 then. As I said, we've been declining. We're in a CO2 famine. We're not we're not bumper. We're in a famine. You know, we went from about four about nearly 7,000 all the way down to very low levels, and then we came up again, and we don't know why, and then we went down again. It doesn't follow temperature either. We're completely separate from temperature when you look at the archaeological evidence over very long periods of time. They don't match, which shows quite clearly that you'll get, when you've got lower levels of what is called that's normal variability, then it will sort of follow a bit, but it follows after, proceeds always after. But if you've got more pronounced changes, you can notice in the evidence, the geological evidence, you can notice the stark differences. Sometimes they go together, sometimes they don't. They can be the complete opposite. Temperature can go up and carbon dioxide can be very low. So, and it just means that sort of planet will be a much drier planet. And not only a dry planet, it'll have less vegetation on it. It'll be more arid. Just is. I mean, there was a period in that we know quite clearly. I think it was 1,000,000 years of rain. There's geological evidence all over the world that for 1,000,000 years it rained in one period. Nobody knows why. There's speculations, all sorts of story, but nobody knows why. So there's a lot of mysteries of things that we don't really understand. So don't be gullible to think that, some expert has worked it all out. Nonsense. Our scientific knowledge is at a primitive level, very basic level. I mean, we've got better instruments, better technology than we had 100 years ago. But the level of understanding, the deep understanding of how the universe works, how the world works and stuff like that is abysmally small. And it's arrogant to think that we understand more than we do. Obviously, Bart said, and I agree with him, that the biggest problem with science is people come up with a hypothesis, they stick their flag, like man, the crackpot, has stuck his flag into the ground, and until he dies, he'll basically defend that like crazy, like Ansel Keys did in the nutritional area and many others. And it's unfortunate that people take such an obstinate sort of attitude. It's usually these people are, pretty much have got certain psychological problems. They are narcissists and tend to be sometimes psychopaths or sociopaths, and are very vindictive to other people, like Ansel Keys was. And man is as well. He's very nasty towards his skeptics. So the characteristics are there, are quite clear that these people don't have all the questions, and to some extent I believe they understand that they don't, but their own ego, their own credibility, they're not willing to countenance anything different. And he's stuck his flag and they'll fight to the death, sort of thing, or until his death, and maybe somebody else will reposition that flag in a different direction. But at the current situation is that large parts of academia have been hoodwinked when it comes to this climate nonsense, and unfortunately, they can't answer any of these questions. When you put credible questions and answers to them, they just can't answer them. They'll come up with all sorts of nonsense, and you go, well, where's the... Okay, let's say your arguments, feedback loops and all this exist and all this sort of stuff to explain what you believe is going to happen. Where is the evidence for those things? They say, oh, we we've got proxies where we can see the model is telling us something. No, I'm telling you, in the real world, where is your evidence? Because the last time they tried with the rock formations under the earth and all that, that's more heat coming up, and then they realised the composition sort of more or less cancelled out a lot of that sort of stuff. There was stuff that actually was going in the reverse, reducing temperature. So that narrative didn't really stick. That they had to sort of walk away from that. So when somebody can't, and when somebody becomes very defensive, saying, "I'm the science, I'm the expert, I know my stuff, I don't need to explain myself," and all that, you go, well, you don't have an answer. Because if you did, then you'd be arguing differently. See, up until very recently, my sort of view was, I don't know. I don't think that the argument for man-made climate change is real, but I can't prove it either way. I look at the Conleys, what they did, and a number of other researchers have shown that there are problems with the narrative, with the story about CO2. When we look at raw data from the past, it sort of doesn't match. Look at the ice core data. Temperature always precedes carbon, not the other way around, like Al Gore tried to, without telling anyone, said, "Oh, look how well they correlate." Yeah, but which proceeded first? Al, which proceeded first? You didn't tell us that, because that's really the crux of the information. So, I had, like any other human, some level of uncertainty, even from the skeptical position. There were still too many loose ends. This recent research, as I said, has allowed me to basically go, okay, now it makes sense. Here's the missing sort of piece, that missing piece that I needed to make sense of this story. And that's cosmic rays. And then it all comes together really beautifully in explaining, you have the big Milankovitch cycles and big orbital cycles that explain those long thousands of years changes in temperature. And this variability between in these interglacial periods, you get this variability. We don't need carbon to explain that. Cosmic rays now explain it perfectly, because it matches perfectly the observation data of temperature with the cosmic ray measurements. And the solar measurements. They all match beautifully, synergistically together, and explain something that still had, from the skeptic side, had some holes, even though their arguments were credible, because they were putting forward arguments. We were saying, where when we look at the raw data, when we look at a lot of this sort of stuff, it doesn't match what you're saying. And they were right about that. But they couldn't as well. The other side was saying, well, you guys claim that the solar is playing the biggest role, but, there's only a very small difference. There's something else happening. They were arguing feedback loops, the crackpots, and the other one was saying, well, there's some other factor that we, but when we look at the raw data, we don't see what you're seeing in the models, because we're looking at the actual temperature gauges, looking at the maritime gauges, so looking satellite, atmospheric, terrestrial, non-urban, and the maritime data, all these four data sets from the raw data, and it doesn't match your narrative. So quite clearly there was a problem with the narrative. And that's why I rejected it, looking at that. I didn't have a complete answer, but it was definitely, there was something wrong with their narrative. But once this cosmic ray element came into the picture, it sort of married it beautifully to explain clouds are making the difference. And it has to do, and that's why we had this from the late 30s, end of the 70s, and now we're going up the other way. And at some point, we're going to go in the other direction. And the frightening thing is, if we get closer and closer to net zero by the middle of the century, and the temperature starts going down, they're going to say, look, that's the reason, because we've lowered the carbon. Well, it's not really the reason. The reason is, as I said, this variability in cosmic rays. So let's hope the message gets out there, that people understand this, and some younger researchers start looking into this, start questioning their so-called academic fathers who are pushing a certain position and not looking at all the data, in a proper way. So that's sort of the reason why I did this video, to sort of point out a lot of the problems in the narrative and a lot of the issues in regards to, how it's being utilised by certain nefarious groups in our society. So some of these younger people that are involved in climate science will take a different look. We'll take another look at this sort of stuff and pulling this cosmic ray information together with these sort of cycles, and go back to the raw data. Go back and grab raw data from all over the planet, not just one country, every country, and look at it. That's going to give you a better picture. I like the Danish Observatory Institute that actually holds on some of this data from Greenland and elsewhere. That's really good measurements. They've got raw data which people can use. And when you use that, in like with what I've talked about and stuff like that, people may start making sense. Now, as I said, greenhouse gases are greenhouse gases. The most potent greenhouse gas is water vapor, but methane and carbon do have a role as well as greenhouse gases. They capture energy. But, and this is the most important thing is that, first of all, the concentrations of both these gases is very tiny within the atmosphere. So their role is very diminished. It's not like Venus, which is just packed with it. Most of the atmosphere is CO2. Or Mars, which is most of it, the atmosphere is also CO2. But the difference is the concentration is so low, it can't hold on to any, any heat, much heat. And that's why it's very cold. Even if it was closer in, it would still be colder. And the reason why it is because it cannot capture sufficient, because it's got very low density. The density on this planet in comparison to the size of all is just, even lower. So that, why would it, it just doesn't make sense. The key greenhouse gas here is water vapor, and cloud formation affects this change between reflecting more of that energy back into space, or allowing more of it to come in due to the level of cloud cover, due to the cosmic rays. That's really what I wanted to focus on, for people to understand the dynamics in that regard. Now, obviously, the atmosphere of Mars is still thinning out because it doesn't have a magnetosphere, and so solar radiation will strip more and more. And even our atmosphere used to be, if you go back to the Cambrian explosion, the barometric pressure of the planet was more like double, and we had a thicker atmosphere. That's why it was even warmer back then, for that reason. not because of the CO2, it was because of the thicker atmosphere, even back then, for that reason. So a thin atmosphere, because ours is thinning, even though we've got a magnetosphere over 500 million years, it has thinned, and it will continue thinning. That's a given, unless we pump a bit more CO2 into it. Let's hope some of the future generations will be a bit more enlightened and understand the value of more CO2 in terms of plant life and stuff like that before we cause any mass starvations on this planet and many people die for unnecessary reasons just because some Malthusian Depop crazies like Bill Gates and others, let's hope they don't get their way, honestly, because that would be a tragedy for the human race. It would be a major tragedy. I am concerned about the future. Most people are blasé. They're in their own little cocoon world. Pretty much that's all they do all day, unfortunately, and don't realise there is a wider world out there, bigger world, and they need to be engaged with it. For the younger people that have an interest in this area, please look further. Don't accept the narrative you've been sold. Look deeper. Look at the evidence. I'm going to put a whole lot of links, stuff that you can go away and look, but go beyond that. If you're serious, you want to understand these things. And don't fear. I know it's probably at an older age, you don't really care if you get cancelled. At a younger age, I know it's harder. I understand. I'm not, I was a young person once and I wanted to fit in. We talk about freedom, but, we have this group mentality. I'm an individual, but I do want to wear that same clothing that everyone else, uniformity. Unfortunately, in younger people don't like to stand out. They do have a lot of uniformity. As you mature, you appreciate who you are, what you are, and stuff like that. Become way more comfortable in your own skin, or more skin you can poke a stick at. But, it is what it is. I'm hoping that I will encourage people to look a bit deeper into these questions. Please share this video with your relatives and friends, and and in particular younger people. They are the future. I'm 58. I'm nearly 60. I've probably got on this planet maybe another, if my cards fall in the right way, maybe another 40 odd years plus. Maybe a bit more. I don't know. Maybe a bit less, potentially. Could get run over by a motorised donkey. Could happen. Or I could be shit on by a flying pig. That'd be nasty. What a way to go. Ugh, frightening thoughts. But please share this around, because the younger people need to start questioning these narratives, because they're going to be the generation that are going to cop it. Because by the time things really get deranged and crazy on this world, I'm going to be in that age bracket on the way out. It's the younger people now that are going to suffer the consequences of the decisions that are made now. And that's why, I'm doing this video to try and inform younger people, I'm not, and giving them information so they understand that that both the skeptics and the ones pushing the narrative, the crackpots, neither of them have a complete picture. There are weaknesses in their argument, even though I believe the skeptics have got a much stronger valid arguments, and they point out the deficiencies of the other side. really well, where the crackpots, on the other hand, of the narrative don't. They just say, we're the experts, we're going to ignore you, because they know they can't argue, because they know that their own information is problematic. That's why they're always trying to search for some magical feedback loops which don't exist. It's only in their models and, blinkered brains that they exist. So I'm appealing to people to question the narrative and to look at, at the new information that's out there and reconsider your views on anthropogenic climate change, because in my personal opinion, it's a myth created by people with vested interests and narratives. But if we don't change the course that we're going down, a lot of people are going to suffer, in particular future generations. And as a person that does worry about the future of humanity and the younger people in particular, who have been sold a lot of nonsense in recent years, through the education system, through the media, through a lot of different social media, many other things, it concerns me that, they will end up holding the hot potato, and suffer the consequences of these nefarious forces. And, some of these crackpots may even believe this sort of stuff. I don't know. But I can tell probably the younger ones are just going along and just repeating the same stuff and making the same adjustments as the other people just to fit in. But it doesn't really matter how they're doing it and stuff like that, or why. The reality is that the consequences are going to be grave for the future of our species and for many generations into the distant future. That's my concern, why I did this video. And please share it around, and please look at the data critically. And those who are in the field, please look at the new information. Please go back to the original sources and reinvestigate them. Do the due diligence. Look at the stuff. Don't just accept things. Don't just keep on citing papers and just regurgitating things, because you're not fooling anyone, you're fooling yourself, and that's the worst thing to do, to fool yourself. I would rather know the truth, even if it hurt me, even if it was painful. I would rather know the truth than to live in delusion. Anyway, that's about it. See yous.